All right, hello everyone. This will be the week 10 final video for aggregate supply and aggregate demand. We'll just start off by just going through one of each type of shift. So one aggregate expenditure, or one money supply, one money demand, one aggregate demand, and one aggregate supply shift. And then we will also cover hawk policy and dove policy. So first off, let me see if I can move this just a little bit. Hopefully this is fine. So we have our three graphs, which are money supply, the money market, the AE market, and we also have our aggregate demand, aggregate supply market. And so this in general case, we're going to start off saying, oh, let's assume that the general price level increases. What's going to happen to the market? So first off, we know that the money demand is going to increase. And so when that happens, we know that the interest rate is going to increase because we now have a new interest rate equilibrium here. And from what we remember in the money market, when the interest rate increases, the aggregate expenditure falls down to here, this point over here. And when what's been covered recently in the units is that when the aggregate expenditure decreases, the aggregate demand decreases as well. And so notice here that aggregate demand has axes with P and Y. So we now have a new P and a new Y. So overall, if we were to sum up all the changes, we know that the new price is decreased, the overall output has decreased, and the interest rate is increased. So that's all you really need to know to solve this type of problem. These three problems here, it's just what happens to the new price, what happens to the output, and what's the interest rate. So next, let's talk about a money supply shock. So let's say we buy bonds. What's going to happen? Well, the money supply is going to increase. And when the money supply increases, we know that the interest rate falls. Interest rate falls, aggregate expenditures rises. And when aggregate expenditure rises, we know the aggregate demand increases. And now we have a new equilibrium here in P and Y. So if you just sum that up, you have an increase in price, an increase in the output, and a decrease in the interest rate. So next, let's pretend that we have an aggregate demand shock for whatever reason. And so the aggregate demand decreases. We're now at this point here. So first off, right off the bat, if the aggregate demand decreases, the aggregate expenditure decreases as well. But you notice here that we have a new equilibrium in price and Y as well. So we have to take that into account. So new P is decreased and the new output is also decreased. So this new price level affects this money demand here. And so overall, the money demand is lower and the interest rate falls. So notice that this one shift here affects both graphs over here. However, we're not going to do things in a cycle because if there's in a cycle, we're like, oh, interest rate falls and we'll target AE, nothing like that. We only work with essentially one shift on each of the graphs and then we're done. So this is just an aggregate demand shock. If we were to do an aggregate demand increase, everything would just be the opposite. You should take some time to get used to working with these shifts. Next up, okay, so just ignore that over here. Aggregate supply shock decreases. Let's say the aggregate supplies decreases, like there's some hurricane or tornado that destroys all your crops or something like that. Aggregate supply shocks decreased. Notice here that the price has increased, but the output has decreased. And so that affects the money demand. So money demand increases and interest rate rises. Overall aggregate expenditures falls. So going back, notice here that we have an issue. So we have these high prices and this high unemployment because all the output that we lost here is unemployment. And so we had to do two policies or one of two policies, either dove policy or hawk policy. Dove policy is a pretty lax policy. Overall, we're trying to target the unemployment. We're trying to get back to the regular output. So the goal is to increase Y. So we're going to pursue expansionary policy. Let's buy bonds in this case. The money supply increases, interest rate falls down to this new level here. And then we next have an aggregate expenditure rises. Since we're at this line here, we're going to increase back up to normal. That means the ED rises. We're now here. So notice here that the Y is where we originally were at, which is here, and now we're here. But notice that we're even higher up in terms of prices. So prices are even higher, but output returns to normal. So this means that we now have these no unemployment in the market, but everyone has to pay higher prices. So it's a trade-off. But on the other hand, if we do hawk policy, we're going to target inflation. We want to decrease the price level. What happens is we have to pursue contractionary policy. So we sell bonds, the money supply decreases, interest rate rises up to here. Then when the interest rate rises, aggregate expenditure falls, and then aggregate demand falls as well. So now we're here. So notice now that the price level has returned to normal. We're back to normal prices, but notice that there's a much, much larger shock in the unemployment. So we could return prices normal, but that's a trade-off in making a lot more people unemployed than would have been. So in considering which policy to use, we have to consider whether or not the high prices are an issue or the large amount of unemployment is the issue. Which is costlier is the one we're going to try and avoid. So if the high inflation is hurting the economy, we're going to definitely try and decrease the inflation. But if the unemployment is hurting the economy, we're going to try to increase the employment. So ultimately, in the end, you just kind of work with each shift and then draw it down, and you're left with an interest rate change, a price change, and an output change. So that's going to be all for this quarter. If you ever have any questions, feel free to reach out. Thank you all for a great quarter.